In the name of Jesus. Amen. We have a unique reading in our Old Testament from Numbers today. We have the children of Israel. Now, they have been in the wilderness for a while. In fact, some of the generation that originally went in has perished. God had tried to change these stiff-necked people, but they persisted on not changing, and so they perished. And now here we are, sometime removed from the beginning of the Exodus. They're still in the wilderness, and we find the children of Israel grumbling. Grumbling once again. Oh, if only we were still in Egypt. Moses, would you bring us out into this wilderness for? Did you bring us out here so that we could perish? We'd be a mockery? Why did you and God do this to them? Oh, if we were just back by those flesh pots in England or in Egypt and enjoying the meat and enjoying the bread and all those good times. And it's like, really? Did you forget that you were slaves? You had no voice? You had no rights? You could be used in any way? Did you forget that you were cordoned off and that you were basically isolated? How easy it is to forget what had happened in the past and call it the good old days. It was very easy for Israel to do that. And they did that quite often. Finally, in fact, until God had to completely have another generation come up before they could go into the promised land. And I know it's hard for us to understand that. But we don't understand a suzerainty treaty, a treaty of unequals, where God actually had the right to just wipe them right out according to that old treaty, but instead God kept them around and kept on trying to reveal His love to them and tried to reveal them the ways that they should walk. Well, in today's incident, God says, you know what, I'm sending snakes. I'm going to just unleash these snakes and just let these snakes have at it. And Moses, if they complain about it, here's what I want you to do. Now, this is what really makes this reading unique. Because you got to remember, this is after the Sinai incident. They already have the law, they have the Ten Commandments, and they have the Levitical laws, which is all their rituals for cleansing. But God comes up with this idea. Moses, here's what you're going to do. If they complain to you, what I want you to do is create a graven image. Did you ever think about that? That always drove me crazy. Here's God who said in those Levitical laws, don't create a graven image. And now He's telling Moses to create a graven image. Make an image of a snake, make it bronze, put it up on a pole. Tell them when they come and they gaze upon that, I will heal them. And the question is, what is God doing? Why is God giving this order to do that? I think it is because God is revealing His love. He's revealing His grace. This is not about legalism. Because Moses had to be sitting there thinking, well, wait a minute, God. Can't we go sacrifice a calf or sacrifice a ram or sacrifice something else or a wheat offering or something that we can do to get you to stop being angry at us? But instead, God goes outside the law and He asks Moses to make a graven image. Because it's about grace. It's about love. You see, what we forget is that grace is not dependent upon the law. That's what Paul is explaining to us in his letter to the Ephesians. That's what he explains to us throughout Romans. That's what he explains to us in Corinthians. It's not based upon the law. Grace is this entity, this thing that operates out of God's love that can't be controlled. God is stepping outside of God's own identity and He's opening up this idea of faith. If they trust what I have to say, Moses, if they believe me this far outside of our identity, if they follow me to the foot of that pole, they will be healed. God's crazy love for His people. It's not easy to see in the Old Testament all the time or in the Tanakh. It's not easy to identify because it gets wrapped up with all these other ancient stories that come in that talk about this wrath or that wrath or whatever. And it's easy to miss God's love. But this is God's love for God's people because He could have annihilated them according to a suzerainty treaty, those ancient language treaties. But instead, He leads them outside of themselves and reveals faithfulness. A faithful God who, even against these people's constant nagging, refuses to give up on them. God's love is not always easy to see. And that's what Nicodemus is struggling with in our reading for today. Nicodemus is a Pharisee. Not only is he a Pharisee, he's a part of the Sanhedrin, which their job is to make sure that everything is kosher. That everything that is happening within their realm is according to the law. And by the time Nicodemus got to Jesus, he was already starting to build up momentum. He's starting to build up his esteem. You got to remember, he was already in Cana, and he changed water into wine. You can't keep that under someone's hat too long. It's permeating around. Plus all the stories he probably shared about grace and love at the wedding. But to top it all off, he goes to the temple on the Passover and he cleans house. I mean, that takes some courage. All those things that pertain to religiosity, that pertains to those sacrifices that God circumvented with the serpent, all those things that pertain to those sacrifices, Jesus cleaned out on the Passover. He got rid of the oxen. He got rid of the cattle. He got rid of the goats, the rams, the lambs. He got rid of the turtle doves. He got rid of the money changers. All those things that were a backbone to their religion of practicing those sacrifices, Jesus cleaned out of the temple. And so now it's time for the Sanhedrin to find out what's going on. And that's what Nic is there. Nic is there as a Hellenistic Jew, a person who understands Greek philosophy, a person who understands Greek way and measuring things out. I mean, he's on the Sanhedrin. He's got a Greek name, Nicodemus. He's a Hellenistic Jew. He goes into Greek rational thinking. And so he's there to talk about theology. He's there to talk about law. He's there to have Jesus show him the signs, show me in the Scriptures that proves that you are a Messiah. But before he can even get to that, Jesus talks to him about birth. Jesus says, unless you're born from above, Nic, you're not going to understand this. You're not going to see it. You're not going to get it. And Nicodemus is going, oh, come on. Really? Born, birth? What's that? How can someone enter the womb a second time and be born again? No, you're not getting it, Nic. You're not getting it. You got to keep in mind that where the wind blows, we don't know where it's come from. We don't know where it's going. Unless you start to understand the relationship with God and this faith in that way, you're just not going to get there. You're not going to understand that. And Nicodemus, after being given a message about birth by the physician of physicians, the healer of healers, by given an instruction on meteorology, he looks at Jesus and he says, I still don't get it, Jesus. What's that got to do with Messiahship? What's that got to do with the theology and the Tanakh? What's that got to do with the law? And this is where Jesus makes one of the smoothest moves I've ever heard. And unless you understand what God was doing in the wilderness with the children of Israel by raising up that snake, we don't really get what Jesus said. He's talking more than just the crucifixion. He's trying to talk a language that Nicodemus, who is a Pharisee, who is deeply within the Tanakh, deeply within the law, should know. And that's what he says, unless you understand Moses raising up that serpent in the wilderness, you're not going to get what's coming next. Unless you're able to release all that law, let go of that law, which is what God was asking the children of Israel to do, and to look up to that serpent, to look up to that woman who is raised on the pole, you're just not going to get it. And Nicodemus leaves that night. And personally, I think he gets a bad rap. He's doing what he was called to do. And Jesus was doing his best to lead him to something new, something better, something more. He's asking Nicodemus to step into the light of what God's love is doing. And it doesn't seem at this moment like Nick will do it. But we know that he does. Because the next scene we have with Nicodemus in it is when the Sanhedrin is questioning the temple police on why they didn't arrest Jesus. Nicodemus stands up and says, hey, well, don't you think we need to do this justly? Don't you think we need to just call him in and ask him what he's doing? Well, Nicodemus, you're starting to sound like a Galilean. And Nicodemus sits down. But his journey doesn't end there. Because the next scene for Nicodemus is shortly after the cross, when we hear that he and Joseph of Arimathea bring over 100 pounds of ointment and perfume to the tomb. You don't hide 100 pounds of ointment and perfume. In fact, it probably looked like a caravan coming in. So boldly and with great courage, Nicodemus steps fully into the light of the cross, the light of our Savior, the light of the Galilean who he went to see at night. And with his actions, he professes a faith that he now has developed with his former carpenter turned rabbi. He started to understand what it meant for the snake to be raised up on the pole when he saw Jesus' body on that cross. To realize that God was revealing his grace in the serpent, and through his Son, he was revealing his grace and mercy and a new covenant that was breaking in on the world. A covenant of love, a covenant of caring, a covenant of compassion, a covenant that he calls us to as his church. And I pray that as we continue this journey of Lent, as our 40 days begin to wind down, that we will think what that cross means to us, what light it's shining in our lives, what it's calling us to do through the church and in the community, how we are to be a reflection of God's grace here and now. The salvation part, that was the easiest thing for God to announce. Could have announced it from heaven and it would have been. But he gave us a Son who came and walked and showed us the light of grace and mercy outside the wall and in an understanding of righteousness in our world today. As we walk this Lenten journey, let us look to the light of the cross and the light of Jesus' righteousness lived out in bone and flesh.